Hey TCS TV viewers, it's Dave and Evelyn from the camera store, and today we're going to talk about how the Nikon Z9 compares to the previous flagship, the Nikon D6.
There has been a lot of chatter, both in the store level and on the internet, about are DSLR cameras even relevant anymore? And especially with the introduction of Nikon Z9, it really makes you wonder, does the flagship D6 even have a place anymore?
It's true, and when the Nikon Z9 was released, a lot of people are calling it the D6 killer. But the D6 isn't even really that old, and it had a lot of top-end technology when it was brought out. And so we want to look at a lot of the key features to see if there is a place for each of them and what some of the differences might be if you're considering both of them. Let's get physical about these two cameras before we get into anything else, because of course they look very similar, but there's some huge fundamental differences between them. The first one is the Nikon Z9 is a full-frame mirrorless camera, meaning that you're actually shooting through an electronic viewfinder and you don't have that mirror mechanism that the D6 has, which allows you to shoot optically through the lens.
And the other really major thing is that the Z9 doesn't have a shutter anymore.
The Nikon Z9 only has an electronic shutter, and so Nikon has done a huge amount of technological advances to make that possible. It's one of the fastest scanning sensors on the market, has an incredibly fast processor, and so that's all put into place to eliminate a lot of the issues that electronic shutters previously had. But yes, you're right.
I love the benefits that mirrorless give us, but I don't like the sound so much.
Me neither. It's not the most positive sounding thing. I mean, your shutter is loud as all get out. So let's just show them what we're talking about here. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready. Oh, what is that? What is that? Is
just a little subtle little pitter patter.
What's going on here? Listen to this. Just keep listening. Just keep listening. Oh, that's good. It is a bit loud, for sure.
It is a bit loud. And I can go completely silently. Of course, you have electronic shutter option as well. Mine's better. You also have the option with the Z9 to plug in headphones. And so if you're someone that's photographing, say, golf, or you're in a place where it needs to be super quiet, maybe like a photojournalistic opportunity or a wedding or something like that, you can plug in earbuds or headphones and you'll be able to hear your shutter to get that feedback.
And it's one of those things, if you're not used to it, you can blast off gazillion frames and not even realize you're doing it. I've had it happen where I've just even carrying the camera around. I'm like, oh my God, what have I just done? I filled up my memory card with pictures of the inside of my camera bag. Yeah. Right? You don't get that experience with this. You know when you're taking a picture. But I can see it. I mean, the benefits, especially shooting things like wildlife, for instance. Guys will wait all day just for that animal to appear, only to scare it away with the blast from the mighty D6.
There you go. Another huge difference, we just briefly touched on it, is the viewfinder. And so with the Z9, we have a 3.69 million dot viewfinder. And they've done everything possible to give it a very natural experience. It's not the top electronic viewfinder on the market, but I think it's very good. And Nikon has actually worked with the technology as well to give it a dedicated pipeline, if you will, and so that you're always getting lag-free shooting, blackout-free shooting. So they're trying to make it as close to the optical viewfinder experience with a direct path of light as they can. Another notable difference with these two cameras is the resolution. So at maximum resolution, 45 megapixels, the Z9 can shoot up to 20 frames per second. And in terms of the buffer, you have about 1,000 if you're shooting in lossy compressed RAW. And if you're shooting in lossless compressed RAW, I was getting about 90 frames with the buffer.
Well, that's pretty impressive. I do have a 20 megapixel sensor, so it is certainly a lower resolution. They're both full frame, though, of course. You know, it really shows how Nikon has improved, because the D6, which isn't that old, can shoot 14 frames per second.
In mechanical.
In mechanical, and pretty much doesn't have a buffer when you're using the CF Express cards.
If I'm shooting in lossless compressed, I got about 90 images in the buffer, and if I'm shooting in lossy compressed, you can get up to about 1,000. Very dependent on the card speed that you're using, but I mean, it's impressive.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The Z9 is a powerhouse. Whatever they got packed inside of there processes a ton of data very quickly. The D6 is a very good camera that way as well, but it doesn't hold a candle to the Z9. Although I can shoot up to 60 frames per second in electronic at a whopping resolution of 2 megapixels.
Yes, and if I want to shoot with my lower resolution option, I can shoot JPEGs at 11 megapixels up to 120 frames per second.
definitely much more usable.
Usable, right? Usable files. So yeah, I think overall when it comes to the speed and performance, how many frames you can get, if you're shooting sports in action, the Z9 is going to take the cake over the D6.
Now these are really fast cameras when it comes to frames per second. So it really shows how mirrorless cameras have a huge advantage. They don't have to deal with that whole contraption, and they can get their frame rate up significantly higher.
The other thing that we should mention when you're popping off all of these frames at these high frame rates is that your camera, because you do have a shutter in it, you're limited with the actuation life of the shutter, where this one's going to just keep going and going and going forever because it doesn't have that shutter that keeps having to snap up and down.
Yeah, I mean, this is the best shutter that Nikon can make, and it's rated for 400,000 actuations. Now,
That's a lot.
I'd like to know from you guys, has anybody ever actually burnt out the shutter on a D6? I'd be surprised if somebody did. There's people I know that have gone well over 1 million shutter counts with a lot of cameras, so I'm not too worried about that at all, but it is something that does wear. Now, another huge leap in technology is the autofocus systems between these two cameras. I can't say enough about how the autofocus has improved over the Z9 compared to these cameras. Here are the DSLRs.
Yeah, I mean, mirrorless technology in general has become insane in terms of the leaps and bounds with tracking technology. And Nikon has come to a place where it's some of the best tracking technology on the market. And so with that, the Nikon Z9 has taken some of the features that the D6 had in terms of 3D tracking autofocus, but you're able to utilize the full width of the sensor for that tracking technology. They've also implemented things like profiles and deep learning into the camera, and so can use some auto detection features in order to determine what you're actually photographing. So whether that's motorsports, wildlife, humans, it can detect people's bodies, their heads, their eyes, everything. I mean, it's come such a long way over DSLR technology.
Yeah, when you first use face detect or something like that, I guarantee you're going to be smiling because it's this crazy technology in your hands, because you'll be just watching how the autofocus just tracks whatever it is within the frame and the entire frame. Where a DSLR camera, you're much more limited to its autofocus technology.
Yeah, and it's always one of those things where, you know, some of the older school photographers are like, it's so easy. Back when I was a photographer in the day, I mean, we barely had autofocus. We had to manually rack focus. And that's true. And there's definitely a technique involved in that. But the other thing that is true is that this technology has made it possible and easier to be able to capture fleeting moments, especially during sports and action sequences or things happening in nature with wildlife, because you're able to just acquire that focus so much faster and hold on to it even more so than the naked eye can. We touched on it briefly, but when it comes to image quality, the Z9 is a higher resolution sensor, and it's implemented as a backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor.
Yeah, when I talk about these high resolution cameras, I always say that they're intoxicating, because 20 megapixels is fairly decent, right? And they used to be kind of more of a standard, but now we're surpassed that. We have a lot more resolution, and once you've started shooting with it, it's tough to go back to a lower resolution camera, I have to admit. Being able to zoom in on details that are much better than you can ever seen with this lower resolution camera.
And this sensor alone, I mean, the base ISO is 64, so it does give you some different capabilities if you're shooting in bright lit scenarios, where the D6, your base ISO is 100. So you get just that little extra bit of oomph when you're shooting in bright scenarios. And then when it comes to dynamic range, when you are shooting at those lower ISOs, or regular ISOs, basically anything under 6400, the Z9 is going to outperform the D6. But this is where things get a little bit interesting.
Very interesting.
The D6 has been a camera that was known for speed performance, but then also optimized for low light shooting capabilities. What we found is that when you're shooting in the more extreme high ISO situations, the D6 actually has better performance. And so we talked to somebody, Rob Galbraith, who had a ton of experience shooting with DSLR cameras, with full frame cameras. He shoots a lot of theater and low light photography, and often has to lift details out of some of the darkest shadows. Hey Rob, thanks so much for joining us remotely. Of course, you and I had a conversation about this before we got into testing the Nikon D6 versus the Z9. And my biggest question was, is it still true with how well the Nikon Z9 high-resolution sensor, how it's implemented, how it is going to compare to the D6 when we look at image quality at higher ISO levels?
The higher you push the ISO, the more noticeable the difference there is in the D6 and the Z9 files that you showed me. And And by the time you get to 25,600, the difference is definitely noticeable. And then some of the examples that you showed that were at ISO 102,000, I think, the D6 files weren't looking great, but the Z9 files were, Mayday. And so absolutely, I think you have illustrated pretty well that there is a difference when working at those really high ISO settings between a lower megapixel camera and a higher megapixel camera, even in 2022.
Yeah, and we've even seen some charts on the internet that other reviewers have taken a look at and have seen that there is a delta in how the sensors performed at those levels. And so we'll put a link in the comments below if people want to check that out. But again, it kind of goes with our viewpoint that when you get into those higher levels, the Nikon D6 does have that advantage. Now, the biggest question that Dave had is this even practical to talk about? And so what kind of photography do you do where you might require those higher levels?
So over the last dozen years or so, I have primarily shot either sports or live theater or a little bit of dance. And in all of those scenarios, my camera would be at ISO 6400 a whole lot more than it would be at ISO 100. And when shooting nighttime sports, I don't know that I would expect to see a massive difference in quality between, say, a D6 and a Z9, because in that scenario, even if you're shooting in a dimly lit, say, high school football game end zone, the light tends to be still even enough that you don't have to do massive amounts of shadow recovery. And that's really where you start to reveal the differences, to my eye anyway, between the lower megapixel and the higher megapixel cameras. When shooting live theater, which is the main thing that I've done as a freelancer over the last 5 years or so, the difference between, take any 20 to 24 megapixel camera and compare it to any 40 to 45 megapixel camera. And what I see in each and every case is that if I'm shooting, say, a play like Macbeth, which is going to be fairly dimly lit overall, and there are going to be many scenes that are dark and moody, and ultimately they're lit so they look good for the audience. And when they're lit so they look good for the audience, when I go in to lighten up the shadows so that my pictures resemble what the lighting designer was going for, oh my goodness, so much weirdness is revealed in the shadows. Now, that's going to be true to an extent in the lower megapixel files, but it is true times 2 or 3 in the files coming from the higher megapixel cameras. You see white noise patterns, posterization, and then also a lot of colored speckles, like in other words, sort of more conventional noise. And it is the kind of noise or the kind of image quality problems in the higher megapixel files that are very hard to fix in processing. And the number one example that I would give there is posterization. There's no amount of noise reduction that can restore tonality in posterized shadows, nor can you say just reduce the resolution of that file. You can't resize it smaller and introduce proper tonality into those shadows. And so it's these types of things, when shooting live theater in particular, that I would, given a choice, always pick a lower megapixel camera. And that would be true, say, 5 years ago, and that would be true today.
Now here's an interesting question. Shooting a DSLR camera in the theater or shooting a mirrorless camera, are you exposing differently with, are you using your histogram or the live histogram in the mirrorless camera? Has that experience changed how you shoot?
A mirrorless camera has transformed the way that I shoot live theater. And in fact, so I did this for a long time using digital SLRs, and I was able to make that work. But there's no question that I lost more pictures to flubbed exposures. I also lost more pictures to them being out of focus. And the lighting designers, in fact, I think some of them, they laugh when they see me coming because they know that for the next couple of hours, they're going to make me work incredibly hard to try to keep up with what they have created. But I definitely have a much easier time of it with a mirrorless camera than I ever did with a digital SLR. In fact, I would not want to go back to using a digital SLR for this kind of photography, for shooting live theater.
So now that you know that from our tests at least, the Nikon D6 does perform better at the higher ISO levels, but it is a DSLR. Which would you choose if all other things were equal between the D6 and the Z9?
Basically, is it image quality or is it functionality? Right? It's kind of that balancing act.
If I had to choose between a D6 or any digital SLR versus a Z9 or really any mirrorless, I would pick the mirrorless camera for sure. And that would even factoring in the greater difficulties that I described working at higher ISOs. So if it's between a digital SLR and mirrorless, if it's between D6 and Z9 all the way. That's an easy one because I will simply be able to deliver more files that turned out for various reasons, including proper composition, proper exposure, they're in focus, that with a camera like the Z9 than I will with the D6, no question. So if you're putting me on a desert island and I've got those two cameras to choose from to photograph the live theater that apparently is taking place on this deserted island, that's what I would choose.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. We appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure.
And
thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Well, that was really interesting talking with Rob. He's so knowledgeable about it. With mirrorless cameras, there's an evolution of photography, and they surpass everything that the D6 can do with the exception of two things: specific case high ISO performance,
yes,
and battery life. And that's
yes. And this is the argument we always say is like, is there any advantages still going back to a DSLR? And battery life is certainly one of them. Your CPA rating is significantly higher.
3580, I think it says, right? Which is massive. Now that might be another case-by-case basis where if your specific needs, you're away from power for a long period of time and you still need to photograph, that might be, the turning point for one or the other.
That's true, yeah, if you're deciding between the two cameras here. Another area, though, where the Z9 is hands down the better option is with video options and video performance. I mean, this camera can shoot an 8K. We have 12-bit RAW. We have lots of awesome recording options, codecs, flexibility, autofocus. It's just a better video camera.
No-brainer. It's
one of the best mirrorless, full-frame video tools on the market right now.
100%. I won't even attempt to try and defend the D6 in that aspect.
Now, when we look at media sources, though, these are both using the same type of memory card.
Yeah, both using CF Express type B cards. So I quite like that, right? So I don't have to have two different kinds of media if I'm going out.
Now, if we were to wrap everything up and just say, is the Nikon Z9 actually a D6 killer? In most ways, I would actually say that, it is the better choice. And because Nikon went so aggressive on the price point of this camera, I'm going to say that we'll probably see less D6s going out the door at camera stores unless someone is like heavily invested in F-mount and maybe they want that better battery life, or maybe they're shooting theater or ballet or something like that where they want that extreme high ISO performance.
Yeah, I mean, the D6 was the epitome of what they could make as a DSLR camera. This was their all-out attack on state-of-the-art technology for a DSLR camera. I love that expression.
You want that quote so badly.
And it is. And in certain applications, it still is a niche-based camera for that. But
it's still an excellent DSLR. I mean, it's one of the best.
Yeah, but the functionality of mirrorless, what they can offer, the higher frame rate, the electronic viewfinder, the exposure preview, like Rob was saying, even though the D6 in certain situations will outperform the Z9 in the higher ISO performance, the advantages of mirrorless that it offers it to them, it's a no-brainer.
Astronomically, absolutely. Of course, as always, we love hearing what you guys have to say about these cameras too. So what is it about the Nikon Z9 that you're most excited about? What do you think about having a shutterless and a mirrorless camera? Do you still think that there's any compelling reasons to still look at a camera like the Nikon D6? Let us know in the comments below.
Make sure you follow us both on Instagram.
And if you're new to our channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so we can catch you again very soon.
Hey, thanks for sticking around and watching this episode. I hope it stirs up some good questions for you. If you want to check out more of our recent content, click up here. And if you're a Canadian, you want to shop local, check out thecamerastore.com down here.